welcome to episode 38 of Roll, Play, Grow, the podcast for tabletop entrepreneurs, creators, and fans. I am Courtney Stover of Lightheart Adventures, and in this podcast, we talk to the creators behind the brands and the tabletop roleplay gaming space about who they are and how they are turning their passion for gaming into a career. Today's guest is M Veselak, a ttrpg designer and the author of Wickedness, recently published by Possum Creek Games. We talk about how she became a gamer at the age of 5, writing games for a LARP summer camp, how she creates their games, what it's like to work with Jay and Ruby at Possum Creek Games, and we get a pretty cool behind-the-scenes look at the upcoming game, Yazeba's Bed and Breakfast. M is a lot of fun, and I really enjoyed getting to know her more. If this is your first time tuning into Roll, Play, Grow, welcome! This podcast is a part of Lightheart Adventures, which is a small company I co-founded with my husband. If you are also a Possum Creek Games fan and want to check out a few other interviews that I've done with them, then I've got 2 more for you. Episode 13 is with the stars themselves, Jay and Ruby. I also had the privilege of speaking with Jamila R Nedjadi in episode 35 about a lot of his games, though we did spend most of our time on Our Hunt, which is another game that Possum Creek recently kickstarted. And then next week, we'll actually get to hear from Aster, who is an artist that has illustrated a lot of their games as well. If you would like to support the show, you can find us on both Patreon and Ko-fi as Lightheart Adventures. I am also a huge sucker for a kind review on Apple Podcasts, and if you do leave me a review, it may even be featured on an upcoming episode. Another way you can support the show is by checking out our affiliate links like Found Familiar Coffee, the most delicious and nerdy coffee that you'll ever taste. And you'll get to collect some pretty cool D&D themed art from their packages. Go to foundfamiliar.com and enter code LIGHTHEARTADV to get 10% off your order, enjoy delicious coffee, and help me keep this show running. That is all for now, so please sit back and enjoy this conversation with M. Today, we are chatting with ttrpg designer and the author of Wickedness, M Veselak. Hello, M. How are you today?
Hi, I'm doing great. How are you?
Good. I'm really excited to dive in and learn about your game and some of the other projects that you've been working on. To start things off, can you tell us a bit about who you are and how you got into gaming?
Yeah, sort of. It's kind of a very long story, and it's kind of hard to pinpoint when I got into gaming, point. I was one of those kids who was always filling up notebooks with mostly board game ideas, weirdly. I think I played a game of Candyland, and then from age 5 onward, I just filled lined notebook after lined notebook with sprawling, almost video game level worlds that were just composed of squares you could land on. And then I have a lot of these left over, and sometimes they get kind of creative in terms of what happens when you land on certain squares. But for the most part, it was strangely a world building exercise more than it was game design, if that makes sense. And, that kind of obsessive notebook scrawling continued for me for a lot of my early childhood. So when people ask me how did you get into tabletop RPGs? I'm I don't know. Does the game I played in first grade count? I have so many rules manuals for it, but I didn't know what a tabletop role-playing game was.
That's awesome. Well, are you playing into any games right now?
I'm sort of between games at the moment, actually. I have, there's a lot of ongoing Dungeons & Dragons stuff. It's the easiest thing, I think, often to coordinate with other people. We're doing a lot of Yazeba's Bed and Breakfast playtesting right now, which is taking up a lot of time. And personally, I'm very excited for Under Hollow Hills, which just came out. That's the Baker's new game. And it's finally released, and that's about a fairy circus sort of traveling through fairyland, and it's very, very good and exciting.
Oh, I haven't heard of that one. I'm going to have to look into that.
You really, really ought to. It's very delightful.
Awesome. Thanks for the recommendation. Okay, so I would love to dive a bit more into your story. So you started with playing essentially in first grade, even if you didn't realize it's what you were doing. How did that transition into writing your own games?
Again, it's such a smooth transition. It's sort of difficult to pinpoint. I think Dungeons and Dragons, when I was a real little kid, was the aspirational thing where it was my friends and I wanted to play it, but didn't know what it was really or how. And it was when you're a child, those manuals, especially for 3.5 or 3.0, are just so incredibly expensive for children to get their paws on. And there's so many of them. So like if you instruct a parent to go get them, there's every possibility that they like brought you back a book that you couldn't play the game with necessarily. But they were all full of like, manuals of monsters and things like that. So I think it was very much like a smooth blended experience of like, we had to make up the games that we were playing because we didn't have the actual like manual resources, if that makes sense.
Yeah. How did you go about doing that?
Well, for the most part, like when I was like younger and like in school, there was this element of like, I met with my same friend every day at recess. We had this elaborate sprawling like set of worlds that kind of followed the same themes over and over again. But like, because we played in it for years at recess, it was like, it would just eventually encompass everything that we had been interested in. Like all of the Star Fox characters were in it at some point. I have probably 2 books full of like invented Pokemon and their move sets and things like that, which is wild. When I became a teenager, I started going to a live action role playing game camp called the Wayfinder Experience, which is how I know Jay and Ruby and, the other Possum Creek Games folks. It's how I know Brennan and like a handful of other people in RPGs. And that was like that was the first place where I was able to like slip into the role of designing games that lots of other people would be playing. Like that was the first place as I transitioned from being a camper to a staff member where like I was ever like paid for game writing, if that makes sense. And it wasn't an awful lot because it was, a summer camp that ran twice a year or whatever. But yeah, it was the first meaningful way I'd ever been like paid for writing. And that felt really good. And the like magic system that we used for our live action camps was very flexible and lent itself very easily to being like hacked and changed to suit each event.
Can you give an example of, I mean, maybe I'm going to word this incorrectly, but like a storyline or kind of what you were able to write for that LARP camp?
The game that I'm most excited about, kind of the one that I left on, which was a high point, was part of one of our finale events. So it was like a large, well-produced LARP that took several days to complete. And that was about a team of explorers who had been hired by this faintly high fantasy British government to travel to a island that had been off limits for a century, where there's ancient ruins that belonged to sort of death cultists. And the player characters, I think there were like 40 usually because it's a summer camp for kids. So like we're always casting the kids in the roles of the heroes, which means we have this huge gang of heroes. So like, this team of 40 experts sort of delving into this hidden island and like defeating all the monsters there and then going into the underworld to see if they can find a way to resurrect the princess of their kingdom. So that was like a classic plot line. And that was a game that I put a lot of effort into in terms of like, I had a lot of, I think at the time, pretty innovative like LARP techniques. One of the things I had them do was when they were in the underworld, I had them literally holding fistfuls of sand from a giant hourglass that represented like their life force. And so they had to like run around in the woods, like sword fighting while holding on to sand that was slowly slipping out of their hands. And it like enabled them to do some things like if they wanted to, they could like throw it to the ground and be like, I'm not coming back from the underworld, but now I can sword fight better to protect my friends. I never told them that they could donate sand to each other, but I was really hoping they would figure it out, and they did. So, that was a very successful bit of like mechanic design for that game. But it was really like, it was a wide range of different kinds of like live action experiences that I got the opportunity to run. And I was very grateful for that. I think that very much informs my work as a designer at the table because I'm very concerned with what people are physically doing with their bodies while they're playing a lot of the time, which is one of the reasons that Wickedness uses tarot cards and not like a dice mechanic or something along those lines.
Okay, that sounds absolutely amazing and like so much fun. And that is really cool. Like, kids come up with the most creative things. Like I used to be a theater teacher and I loved doing any kind of like improvisational game with them because you never knew what they were going to do. So that sounds really fun.
Yeah. And, like live action role playing is basically just improv. We actually taught a lot of like improv techniques at camp. I think we still do. I haven't been there in a little while, but we taught and teach like improv techniques because they just make for stronger role playing. And I think that also carries over into tabletop. Having that understanding of how to support scenes and how to support other players, I think is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd say that having a little bit of a background in improv and theater definitely helps. Like, it's not that you need it, but I feel like it definitely helps with your character building.
Yeah. And then when you're doing like tabletop game design, it's another angle to look at your design from, in terms of like, is the text that you're writing an improv partner to the players? Is it giving them suggestions, or is it the rules to the like game that they are playing? Is it like a meaningful constraint that's giving them more room for creativity? Is it a jumping off point? Is it an audience suggestion? And I think that that's like an interesting way to maybe conceptualize a lot of like what you're actually doing with the text when you're designing games.
Yeah, that's a really good point. So going along the timeline some more. So you said that really writing for the LARP games once you became on staff was the first time you ever felt like you really got paid for what you're writing. Or when did you decide to start publishing games, and kind of how did that come about?
It's not, I had been writing games in like squirreled away Google Docs for probably a decade and never like shown anyone anything. And it pretty much 100% was J-Dragon and like Possum Creek Games, just sort of reaching into the ether as like a personal friend and being like, this is good, we're going to publish this. So, fully on the belief of my publisher did this game come into existence.
That's amazing. Yeah, so please tell us about Wickedness.
Yes, so Wickedness is a tabletop role-playing game for exactly 3 players and a tarot deck. Players take on the roles of a coven of witches, each with a very powerful archetype behind them, and it is their sort of duty in the world that they exist in. Players will design as part of the first step of gameplay. It's their duty in the world to sort of maintain this balance between the mortal world, the underworld, and their own personal relationships. And those things are potentially a big struggle. Challenges are sort of laid out by the tarot deck itself, and you sort of use the interpretation guide that the game provides to figure out what's going on, and it sort of guides everyone in improvising like what the situation is. And then from there, it's kind of up to the players how to resolve things, if that makes sense. Like the tarot deck is constantly throwing problems at you, and then you're looking to your characters to solve them. It's a tough game, I want to say, in that it's very much designed to get its hooks into you and force you to care about these main characters very, very much. And then a lot of the game is them making very tough choices for themselves and for each other.
Okay, yeah. So I know that there's essentially 3 like smaller books if you're getting it in a physical format versus altogether as a PDF. But can you just go a little bit into detail on what kinds of things you're finding in the rulebook versus the play pages versus the interpretation guide?
Yeah, so the game does, if you buy the physical copies, which honestly folks should, from Possum Creek Games, the physical copies are beautiful. They came out better looking than I could have possibly hoped. They have like gilded front pages, and it's just great. Jay and Ruby did an incredible job with the design. Ruby in particular with the layouts is just a wizard. And of course, my partner Tucker did all of the illustrations for the interiors of the books, and Tucker's also quite talented. So yeah, you should get the physical copies if you can. And if you do, basically the game is divided into 3 zines. The first is the core rules, which walks players through how to play. It's intended to be written so that you can just be reading how to play as you're getting started. You don't have to like read the book forward to back before you get started. You may want to if you're that sort of person, and that's fine too. There are no surprises that will jump out at you particularly. The interpretation guide is for actually understanding what the tarot deck is trying to say to you as you begin play. It's where most of the meat of the story is. And the play pages are all of the playbooks and like setting sheets that players will find, including a bunch of alternate settings of and play pages by our stretch goal guest authors who did a bang up job. And, the default setting of Wickedness is sort of a like not medieval, but like Pratchettian high fantasy almost, or like Miyazakian fantasy world. But there are 2 additional rule sets that let you play in a cyberpunk world and also in a like urban fantasy world. And they're both really marvelous. People have been, now that the game is out, been playing with those sets, and I'm just very delighted by them and all of the stories that I've heard from players.
That's awesome. What was your inspiration for this game?
It kind of came from a bunch of different places. Inspiration always does. I've always been a fan of specifically like Howl's Moving Castle, both the Miyazaki movies and the book adaptations. I'm a big fan of Terry Pratchett's Discworld. I love the Lancaster witches and their coven is incredible. And I think their fingerprints are very deep on the game in a big way, in that like the way that Pratchett envisioned witches as squabbling is like very impressed upon all of the social challenges that the coven has to deal with. Yeah, I love them so much. Game design wise, I think one of the bigger influences, weirdly, is like Damn the Man Save the Music, which is maybe a wild choice, but because the mechanics don't actually resemble it that thoroughly, but they also have the like 4 different card suits. Each represent a kind of problem that's happening. And that was like a big pillar for me figuring out how the game was going to work. The very first original, I think, thought that eventually turned into a game mechanic was way back when Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition was coming out. They had a playtest version of the Sorcerer that I got so excited about, where it was like, they weren't using spell slots, they were using like a point system to cast spells, and as their spells depleted, they started to get like monstrous features, like they grew claws and wings and whatever. But they scrapped that version, and it's very frustrating to me because I was like, yes, perfect. Exactly like when Howl casts too many spells and turns into a big bird monster, the most exciting thing that there is. So, I kind of came up with the very first like mechanical thought in this game was like, okay, so how would I actually make this work in more of a like diceless game potentially? And so I sat down and I came up with the like sources and like strike and blacken mechanics, which are, each of the coven mates has 3 sentences about them that are, sort of unique to the character that they are. And, the first sentence is on the surface, I am. The second sentence is varies by the archetype, but is like, I fight for. And the third sentence is deep down, I am. And usually there are 3 like adjectives or descriptors there attached. And the way that witches cast true magic in Wickedness is they cross off one of those things, which becomes no longer true about that character, in order to enact just a like huge world-changing magic, potentially. There aren't really limits on what the witches are capable of doing in Wickedness. I wasn't really interested in like blocking out, here's what magic does, and it works X way every time. It's really more like, what your witch's specialties are, and you can accomplish almost anything with them if you're striking one of your sources out. And then beyond that, if you strike that source again, so if you use that same trait to like fuel your magic even further, you don't just cross it out, but you like scribble it all the way out and replace it with something else, usually something eldritch and frightening. So that's kind of how the like sources system works in Wickedness. And it was probably the first mechanic to actually fully realize. I think there's just something very interesting to me in the way that, individual people, especially queer people, Wickedness is very much a queer analogy in a big way, often can accomplish these amazing, incredible things. But, we also have to acknowledge that there is a price paid for that in terms of like burnout and distress. And, these 3 people can save the world, but why is it their job is really the key question here. Is it fair that it falls on them?
That is a really interesting question to kind of have your players face throughout the game. And honestly, if I knew nothing else about the game, just knowing what you just listed as all of your inspiration would be enough to make me buy every copy I could. Like, that is super fun.
Well, to be clear, nobody needs to buy more than 1 copy. I'm happy if they do, but
Yeah.
you actually do only need 1 to...
More to share with friends.
Perfect, yes.
Amazing. Okay, well, you actually started going a little bit into a question that I love to ask. So I kind of want to keep going with it, but I would love to know about your whole process. So started a little bit of where it started with after the Sorcerer playtesting for 5th edition and how you wanted to take what was cool and make it better. But yeah, I would love to just know from that point up until getting published with Possum Creek Games. Like, I'd love to know everything that happened along the way.
Yeah, so I kind of had that mechanic set just sitting in a Google Drive for like a couple of years, which is maybe a crazy thing to say. I know that a lot of broadly, a lot of people like to work on projects. They try to complete it and like focus single-mindedly on it. I just wasn't in a position to do that. I was always bouncing around between projects, and I still am, to be honest. But it sat in a Google Drive for like again, like probably at least 5 years, I want to say. And I'd keep revisiting it and being like, what does this fit into? And I tried sort of leveraging it into some of the other projects that I was considering, and it kind of didn't quite fit. So I sort of just started using it as the core point of development outwards. So the like system of striking sources came first, and then sort of developed outwards into the next thing I developed, I think, was the 3 coven mates who, I think very much the core strength of the game rests on how like identifiable those 3 archetypes are. In Wickedness, we have each of the players is playing one of the Old Soul, the Wild Spirit, and the Pure Heart. And they're sort of like a roughly aligned group to the Maiden Mother Crone trio, but they're a little different because I wanted, I'm a trans person, and I wanted to like degender them to a degree and also like regender them. So, the Pure Heart is like a young, innocent person, not necessarily young, and the Old Soul is not necessarily old, but like is a person of innocence who is like coming to the coven the newest and freshest, has the least grip on their magic. The Wild Spirit is probably the most powerful of the 3, if that makes sense, but they're not necessarily the best witch. Yeah, they are extremely powerful, extremely dangerous, extremely uncontrolled, probably emotionally volatile. And then you have the Old Soul, whose magic is more pointed towards identifying and understanding and knowing things, and like is probably the most subtle of the 3, but is very caught up in their own head. And I think these are 3 archetypes that a lot of people move throughout their lives. Like I, as a trans person, have definitely moved through all 3, mostly in like not the order that you would expect. So the 3 archetypes were like the next game thing to really solidify. And then I was stuck for a while. I wasn't really sure how. I think I was still thinking that this might be a dice game, but also knew that dice were wrong for it because they're just a little too random and a little, I don't know, dice feel wizardy to me. They're not witchy, they're wizardy, at least in my head. So I was a little stumped. I think the like aha moment came when Jay was playtesting Sleepaway for its first release. And Sleepaway is a game that uses a deck of playing cards. And you're all counselors at a summer camp. Surprise, surprise, where we met. But it's a horror game where you are counselors at a summer camp trying to protect your campers from the Lindworm, which is a terrible monster that inhabits the game and is secretly communicating with you through these playing cards. And seeing how Jay sort of used the playing cards as a like full, like not as a game mechanic, but as a full like invocation method for conjuring a ghost that really haunts the game, made me go, oh, I don't need to use the tarot cards as anything but tarot cards. And so the next step was writing the interpretation guide and setting up, finding different challenges for each of the minor arcana in a tarot deck. And that took probably the longest, not years wise, but the longest writing wise, the most like active effort. Because I don't know if you know this, but there are a lot of cards in a tarot deck.
Yes, there are.
Yes. So it took a long time to really identify the challenges that would be unique, but like themed together, and really like nail down exactly how that was going to function. And then the rest, I think, like the very fiddly, like mathematical bits tend to come pretty easily to me. So that actually took almost no time at all to like figure out numerically how, and like probabilistically how to like structure the rest of the game. That all kind of slipped into place once I understood, what the core mechanic was and who was at the table.
Yeah, definitely. At what point did Jay see this?
That's a great question. I think Jay saw bits and pieces while I was working on it. I think it became a reality that Jay was going to help me get it published when the game itself was like finally actually like nearing completion. I asked Jay to playtest with me briefly. It doesn't take that many players to playtest because, again, it's 3 players in a tarot deck. And I think Jay had an extremely fun time. And that also contributed to like, okay, we're going to publish this game now. So yeah, I think it was at the playtesting phase is really when Jay got a full eyeful of the game. But, I had been talking to Jay about it for a long, long time before that, like a couple of years, I think.
So had you considered wanting to publish it yourself before that?
Honestly, like I think I had an itch page already and like had a couple of small experimental games up, but the idea of actually kickstarting anything or getting actual eyes on any of my projects was just so far beyond the realm of what I was familiar with that I don't think I did conceptualize that at any point. Yeah, I'm very much not an industry insider. I know a lot of people in the games industry almost tangentially from summer camp specifically.
Well, yeah. So then what was the Kickstarter experience like?
Truly unreal. I'm not a person of wealth or means, and watching people pour thousands of dollars into a project I was working on was really a life-changing experience. You know, I didn't make out like a robber baron, but certainly it was like not an ignorable amount of immediate income for me, which was wild. Kickstarter just kind of works for small indie creators in a way that, you know, I would have been skeptical of before trying to launch a project through Kickstarter, because it almost seems like it's too good to be true at start, at least. Yeah, my experience was extremely positive. And part of that is that, you know, I had very low expectations for where my games were going and sort of what was possible for small publishers, but they were all very strongly exceeded.
So no, like that's great to hear that it was such a good experience. How, I guess, involved were you? Was that something that you were able to just kind of pass off to Possum Creek to handle?
I was pretty involved in the Kickstarter. Jay did suggest that I hire them on as a project manager, and I did, and it was an extremely good choice. I don't know if they're still soliciting projects to manage. I think Possum Creek Games now at this point has its hands extremely full, but it was an extremely positive experience. Jay had already kickstarted a couple of projects before and kind of like smoothed the way for me in a very nice way. Yeah, I was very involved in like the copy editing and a lot of the planning process, and in terms of like chasing down stretch goal writers and things like that. But for the most part, Jay kind of took care of a lot of like, Jay did all of the like letting me know what had to be done, which was, there's a little bit of a missing stair there in terms of like, you can dig through all of the Kickstarter FAQs, but it's so helpful to just have somebody who has already done a successful Kickstarter before kind of coach you through it.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Hey entrepreneurs, I love introducing you to new creators every episode, but I could really use your support. I would love to invite you to join our Patreon page, where you'll gain access to behind the scenes content, add your questions to upcoming interviews, and you could even receive a shout out on our site in an upcoming episode. To learn more, go to lightheartadventures.com/RPG. And now back to the show. So you mentioned some people earlier that helped with like creating the artwork and the layout, but I'd love to just hear about what that process was like. So kind of, you know, how much of guidance were you able to give on what type of art style you wanted and what you wanted the pieces to look like, and just kind of, yeah, how that worked with that collaboration side of things.
Yeah. So I'm blessed in that Tucker Donovan, who did all of the illustrations for the interiors and also the covers for the like standard Wickedness editions, is my partner. So I can just go and bully him into doing whatever I want for the most part. He's an extremely talented artist. I think you can catch a lot of his art explicitly on the not most recent now, but I think second most recent Dimension 20 series, Mice and Murder. He did all of the illustrations for that as well. And he's kind of he's incredible because he's a style chameleon. So like he kind of just can adapt his art style to virtually anything I want, which is great for me. Yeah. And I had a lot of input on what the illustrations on the interior would look like, but I also gave him a ton of free reign. So like almost all of the like silhouetted characters that you'll see on the interiors are, you know, I gave him the parameters of like, I want there to be, fat people represented in this game. I would like for some people to have like some visible disability or like mobility aids. You know, I want a range of like body types and gender expressions. And so like we worked out a little matrix of that. But otherwise, like the details on those characters are just 100% him. And they're all very cool looking. I'm very excited about them just generally. And he made so many little like delightful flourishes and like trinkets and potion bottles and things just to stuff the pages with, and, you know, then handed them off to Ruby, who is really just a layout and design like wizard. I did not have that much input over her, but she just did everything that I wanted perfectly anyway. Yeah, we talked about like the fairy tale book cover design style and sort of the tone of the game. And then she just went to town and produced truly a beautiful text. One of the things that Possum Creek Games is probably going to be known for in the next several years is just tremendously beautiful books, because Wickedness is gorgeous. They just released Wander Home, which of course made a huge splash in the tabletop scene and is most remarkable perhaps for the incredible art direction that Ruby pulled off with so many illustrators and just so jam-packed with art on every page and so beautifully designed.
Yeah, the artwork in Wickedness is really pretty. And so it's really cool to hear how that comes together along with the game design. So one thing that I am very curious about is about the choice to make this a 3-person RPG. So I know you can really run the gamut of whether it's going to be a solo RPG or 2 people or larger parties, especially if you're doing like the dragon game. But yeah, like why 3 people?
To me, 3 players is like a sweet spot where it's still extremely close and intimate, like a 2-player game, but it's not just batting the same ideas back and forth like it's, across a tennis court. You do have that like the slight chaos of having a third perspective point to consider. So I think 3-player games in general are just very fun. I like to keep party sizes small in like other RPGs when I play them. I think it's very nice to have 3 players at the table, just generally. But also I had looked around and I had thought to myself, okay, there are a lot of solo RPGs. I've seen a goodly number of 2-player RPGs at this point. I don't really see any 3-player RPGs, and like that's the classic, Sacred Trio. Like that's the classic Witch Coven. You need your maiden mother and crown. And so I think it was kind of inherent to the project always, but I felt very good about that being sort of an emergent design element because it kind of was very unique.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And you're right. I'm starting to see more duet games. And of course, 4, 5, 6 seems like the most popular. So yeah, it's really cool and interesting to see that there is a 3-person game out there now.
Yeah, I think there must necessarily, I don't think Wickedness is the first one, but yeah, I think it is a field that could use some more population for sure.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, I would like to switch gears a little bit and talk about some of your other works. So I know that on your itch page, you've got White Hats, Dragon Roads, Games of the Year, and then I know that you're also working or helping work on Yazeba's with Possum Creek. So yeah, I would just love to learn more about the other things that you've done.
Yes, those games are all much more experimental, I think, than Wickedness. Dragon Roads is a massively multiplayer driving game, which is mostly a concept, really, and like a way of relating to your car. It would be more than that if more people were playing the game. So I guess get your friends into it, and suddenly it is more like a digital pet game almost. But for the time being, yeah, Dragon Roads is a game where your car is a dragon, and you are attempting to take care of it, and you track its stats, and you can have dragon duels with other people whose cars you might decide to drive in. It's all a little, perhaps, less accessible during the pandemic, unfortunately, because we're mostly not all hanging out at the same houses and then driving places. But it was an extremely fond idea to me at the time. I'd had the same car for like 10 years. And, as the primary playtester, my car's stats were very, very good. It was a very strong dragon. So that's Dragon Roads. White Hats was another kind of very experimental game where it's about a pair of hackers kind of hacking and counter-hacking each other. And the core design idea behind it, at least, was that hacking in tabletop games is always, for the most part, extremely boring. And like, it's a skill roll or whatever, and not as exciting as it is in the movies. So in White Hats, the main mechanism, the conflict resolution system, is not dice rolls or cards or anything like that. It is instead a game of Minesweeper that you are passing back and forth and trying to psych the other person out into losing. And, there's like some subtext there. It's entirely possible for this like government hacker and this anarchist to fall in love or whatever. And it's like played in 3 rounds. It's a really short 2-player game. And of course, we have Games of the Year, which, I don't know, are you very familiar with the like lyric games scene?
I am a little bit, but for the sake of our listeners, please tell us more.
I'm probably not the best person to explain the lyric game scene. There are tabletop games that are perhaps not fully constrained by our usual definitions of what a game is. If you come at them from a position of like, this is going to be like playing Fate or GURPS or D&D, you will probably not not enjoy the experience that you're having. But lyric games are more thought exercises, or often poetry, I think is where the term lyric games come from, or like life philosophy that is sort of packaged in the style of a tabletop game that you are playing. And Games of the Year is me dipping my toe into that world and designing 12 games, which are technically playable. I think all of them, you can technically play them, but which mostly are thought experiments, or, I would call them spells, but that's my thing. Yeah, it is partially a compilation of games and partially a grimoire.
That's cool. What was kind of the timeline or maybe the decision process on putting those up on itch.io?
It was just a good spot to put them, I think. I didn't really have a strong, coherent, overarching plan for how to put them up. I kind of just put things up as I finished them. I think those like small project, like micro RPGs are very accessible for new designers and for designers kind of getting into the space. And I wanted to participate in that scene, so I did.
Okay, yeah. I guess I was curious because earlier you mentioned that you've had all of these projects that you've been working on for years that have kind of been living in folders. And so I was just curious on what happened, maybe if that's the right word, to make you want to publish these 3.
Oh, well, I think because they're small and experimental, they were very easy to complete. And a lot of the stuff that I have like still jumbling around in Google Docs is like also small and experimental, but like wants to be a fragment of a much bigger whole. And it just takes a lot of time to write a book. And I haven't always had a lot of time to spare for that. So I think Wickedness, is really the first time I've had something come together in that big way and, be strong enough that I was very proud of it and did want to share it.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
That's cool. So please tell me about your current project that you're working on.
Yeah, let's talk about Yazeba's Bed and Breakfast. Yazeba's Bed and Breakfast is a tabletop role-playing game for any number of players. It features a pre-made setting and pre-made characters. You play either the residents who live at and work at the bed and breakfast that the game takes place in, or one of the rotating cast members who are the guests at the bed and breakfast. And the game takes place over currently 50 and more chapters of gameplay, each of which sort of forms a mini-game style, like self-contained episodic adventure that can be completed in like 1 to 2 hours. So it's a very perfect pick up and play game where if you have people who can't make it to your game night, it doesn't matter. They just don't have to be in that episode. It's very perfect for like players dropping in and dropping out. It's perfect for people who aren't sure that they want to commit to a longer term game. But it also has all of these legacy mechanics whereby the book is slowly changing as you play it. So even though it is designed for like one shots and small little play amounts, there is a like deep campaign almost where the characters are evolving and the bed and breakfast is evolving, and the more characters are being unlocked, more chapters are being unlocked as you play. So even though it's a perfect like party game, also all of the things that you're doing do matter long term, and there is that deeper sense of, I think often when you play a one shot, there can be like a end of the world syndrome where the players can feel like nothing they're doing matters, so it can get very silly very fast. And Yazeba's is a very silly game, but it is also a game where the emotional consequences of things do matter, and they matter long term in a way that goes forward from each play.
Is there a team of different writers that's working on this?
Yes. So I'm writing the game with my co-creator, Jay Dragon, who sort of approached me and had like a lot of setting elements right at the beginning, sort of not nailed down, but sort of foggily in place. And we've been working on it for a couple of years together. And then I also have Lily Harris and Mercedes Acosta, who are co-writers that we've sort of taken on since then and who have added just a tremendously exciting new spin on several of the residents and like really picked up and like adopted elements of the game that we weren't quite sure about yet and have become invaluable members of our writing team. And currently we're, I think, entering the home stretch of stuff to be written, which is really wild because it's a monstrously huge book. There are so many characters, so many chapters to explore, and it's just really exciting to see it all finally coming together, but it's also a little bit melancholy almost for me and Jay to be like, well, we've written all of the guests. We're not allowed to come up with zany new fun people anymore because they won't fit in the book. Oh no, our design activity that we did when we were stressed out is now no longer available to us because we have written almost the whole book. It's fine. Jay will just write a different book whenever Jay is stressed. So
Yeah, I heard that that's how Wanderholm came to be, was Jay needed a break from Yazebas.
No, I needed a break from Yazebas because...
Oh, really?
Yes, Jay is prolific and a prodigy, and I love them very dearly. And also, being their co-creator can be demanding at times. And I decided to take a weekend or a week off. And when I came back, Wanderholm was almost totally finished. So
amazing.
Yeah. Kind of the hit RPG of 2020 and 2021 is, of course, a bookmark in the center of Yazeba's bed and breakfast, which perhaps says something about the colossalness of the book and how excitingly gonzo it is.
I mean, yeah, it makes me even more excited for when this comes out. So I know you're not going to be able to give a specific date, but are we thinking spring of next year?
Yes, I believe the game's going to kickstart in March of next year. We're not sure what the end production timeline looks like, and that's very much not my wheelhouse. So that's when the game is written, I will be ready to go to sleep. Yeah, you should watch that space. You should definitely follow the Possum Creek Games Twitter if you want to get updates on that. And also, I don't know, maybe I'm biased because they're my publisher, but I do think Possum Creek Games is putting out some of the most interesting and innovative RPGs that there are currently. And that's not just me, that's all of the other creators that Jay has sort of recruited and agreed to help bring their games into reality or remake their games in a better, shinier format.
I mean, I'm just going to say that I agree and intend on buying every game Possum Creek publishes. So
we love to hear that.
Yes. Okay. Before we wrap up, there are a couple questions that I do like to ask in every interview. So the first of which is, when you look back over really, I guess, the last couple of years as you've kind of started on this journey of dabbling with different games, getting a couple published, and then the Wickedness journey, and now you're working on Yazebas, I'd like to acknowledge that there are challenges in working in this industry. So I would like to know what you have found to be the most challenging part of this.
Honestly, getting started is just very difficult. There's all of the personal creative challenges in terms of I think a lot of writers identify with the too many projects syndrome that I am always juggling. But I think that it can be difficult to know once you have your project that you want to release. It can be difficult to know what the steps are to take to actually accomplish that. And to those folks, I would say Kickstarter's actually a really good platform for first-time publishers and first-time writers. If you can put together a professional-looking pitch, you can probably raise the funds to get design, layout, and illustration done. Kickstarter is kind of great because it comes with its own built-in platform. There are a lot of people who just cruise Kickstarter looking for things that they might like to fund. You don't necessarily have to already have a huge following to make it work that way.
That does tend to be, I think, a challenge for a lot of people is,
yes,
you want to do the thing, but it takes work and it takes a lot of effort and motivation that is not always there.
Yes, I can't help with motivation, but I can help with one of the things that can sap motivation is not knowing whether or not the thing is going to ever see the light of day, and saying hey, it actually isn't that hard to get a published thing some attention if you finish it, I think is probably helpful.
I think that's a really good point. Well, let's flip it around. And so same kind of time frame of just, as you've gone on this journey, what would you say has been the most rewarding part?
This is going to sound so trite, but it's extremely true. Just getting feedback from people who have gotten their hands on Wickedness and hearing about people's playthroughs of it, and just the sheer joy that it has brought people has rebounded upon me threefold. It is really a delight to see something that you worked very hard on and is chock-a-block full of things that you like also be received by people and immediately beloved.
Yeah, I imagine that has to be really cool and that you've heard some really interesting stories.
I truly have. There's been such a diversity. And, I encourage players always to at me on Twitter or DM me, or if they have access to the Possum Creek Games, Discord server, drop some information in that chat and just kind of tell me how their playthroughs went. Cause it really truly does just bring me such joy.
That's amazing. Okay. Are there any upcoming projects or other things that you've worked on that we didn't get a chance to talk about that you're excited about and want to say something about?
I mean, the big pitch is always going to be for Yazeba's Bed and Breakfast. I can't say enough that I would really love it if folks would follow Possum Creek Games on Twitter or sign up for their newsletter on their website, possumcreekgames.com, just so that they are aware when it launches its Kickstarter, because that game is going to be very different, I think, than most of the tabletop games anyone's ever seen or played before. And also, I think it's going to reinvent some things. So I don't think anyone will want to miss it.
That is an interesting claim, and I look forward to seeing what that means.
I always feel so pretentious when I tell people, yeah, it's going to reinvent the tabletop role-playing game. It's such a silly thing to say, but it is we did take most of the basic assumptions of how role-playing games are supposed to work and totally invert them. We very much took everything we knew about game design and shook it upside down until all of the loose change fell out so that we could put that loose change in the game. So yeah, I think it actually is going to you know what? I don't need to defend myself here. There is a free playtest kit out. You can get it from the Possum Creek Games itch.io page. Again, 100% free. It is an artless, undesigned ash can document that you can use to playtest the game. It's probably about a quarter or a fifth of the final game content, but everybody who's looked at it has already been oh, this is blowing my mind on every page. So yeah, I don't need to back up. I don't need to explain my statement about how it's going to change the entire industry, because you can just go look and agree with me.
Amazing. Okay. I'll make sure to have links to all of that in the show notes, but where can people find you, Em?
I'm on Twitter at Nightlingbug, and I'm also on itch at Nightlingbug. Those are the two main places you can find me.
Awesome. Em, this has been such a fun conversation. Thank you so much for coming on today.
Oh, thank you for having me. I also had a great time.
You just finished another episode of Roll, Play, Grow. To check out the show notes from today's episode, you can go to lightheartadventures.com/RPG. To keep up with every episode, please subscribe on your podcast player of choice. And if you're enjoying the show, I would absolutely love if you would leave me a review and share this episode with your friends. Your review might even get featured on an upcoming episode. To follow me on Twitter, you can either find me at LightheartADV for our business account, or at KetraWCR for tweets on gaming, my dog Bowser, and other random shenanigans. You can also find us as Lightheart Adventures on both Instagram and Patreon. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you next time on Roll, Play, Grow.